K.H. Douglas Macgregor asserts that according to Secretary Blinken, the current situation in the region is possibly the most perilous since World War II, and conceivably even in the past 2 centuries. He emphasizes the extreme volatility and explosiveness of the situation, suggesting that few in the United States and Europe truly grasp its gravity. He believes that the greatest danger lies in the failure of individuals within the United States government to acknowledge the current situation, particularly since the events starting on October 7th in Gaza. He highlights the series of attacks against US forces in the Middle East and attempts to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea involving vessels linked to the US and Israel. These occurrences, he emphasizes, are not random, but rather a consequence of the campaign in Gaza. He rejects the notion that Muslims inherently hate the West, attributing hostility to specific actions. He suggests that if the US wants these attacks to cease, it must pressure its allies, implying that such actions could alleviate much of the hostility towards the US. He warns of the potential for a regional conflict primarily involving Israel and the United States, with the risk of terrorism within US borders due to lack of immigration policies. He criticizes the inclination towards initiating a bombing campaign against Iran as a principal issue facing the United States. He believes that over the past few decades, there has been a deliberate effort to portray Iran as the primary source of trouble in the region, particularly by Israel. Israel, he argues, has made Iran its main adversary and has convinced many that unless Iran is eliminated, there can be no peace in the region. However, he finds this portrayal misleading, asserting that other states in the region are equally or even more hostile than Iran. He suggests that the influence of Israel lobbyists in the US through campaign donations and favors to key figures in the government has led to the demonization of Iran in American public opinion. He questions the justification for considering the killing of 3 American reservists in Jordan as a casus belli against Iran, especially when compared to other pressing issues, such as the opioid crisis and domestic violence. He implies that the focus on these deaths as a reason to initiate military action against Iran is disproportionate. He recounts a conversation with a senator who emphasized the deaths of the 3 Americans as justification for aggression towards Iran, but he challenges this perspective, highlighting the complexities surrounding the incident, including the involvement of a Shiite militia group in Iraq. He believes that the situation since October 7th has been used to scapegoat Iran. He clarifies that the presence of US forces in Iraq and Syria is not primarily related to ISIS, as that threat has largely diminished. Instead, he suggests that the justification has been shifting, initially with vague answers until it was finally attributed to serving Israeli interests and acting as a deterrent against Iran. He criticizes this reasoning as flawed and ill-conceived. He also suggests that maintaining a significant military presence in Iraq helps perpetuate the illusion that the intervention there has been successful and desired by the local population, which he asserts is not the case. Additionally, he mentions the strategic importance of the Kurds in the region, both as a potential leverage against Iran and Turkey, and as a reason for the continued presence of US forces. He expresses concern that the recent deaths of 3 individuals are being exploited as a pretext for further military action. He observes that President Reagan had a different approach towards the region, not unconditionally supporting the Israeli government's desires and avoiding putting US forces in harm's way solely for Israel's strategic benefit. However, he notes a shift in current government perspectives, aligning more closely with the idea of using US forces as a strategic asset for Israel's benefit. He suggests that this viewpoint is shared by both the government and Congress, seeing it as an opportunity to confront Iran. He firmly disagrees with the notion of using bombing as a means to subdue adversaries, citing historical examples such as Vietnam and World War II, where such tactics did not yield favorable outcomes. He argues that instead of achieving their goals, such actions tend to alienate more people and strengthen resistance against the US. Regarding Netanyahu's approach, he believes that the Israeli Prime Minister is adopting a high-stakes strategy, viewing the situation as an all-or-nothing scenario where Israel's survival hinges on either eliminating its adversaries, particularly Iran, or facing potential destruction. He criticizes this approach as dangerous and lacking nuance, suggesting that Netanyahu is willing to risk Israel's stability and potentially its existence in pursuit of his objectives, which prioritize eliminating perceived threats to Israel's dominance in the region. He expresses uncertainty about the current situation, acknowledging its lack of promise. However, he suggests that the Iranian leadership's priorities extend beyond the immediate issue of hostages, focusing instead on broader strategic objectives, such as asserting dominance in the region and eliminating perceived threats, particularly from Arab populations within Israel. He believes that achieving these objectives would be difficult without the support of the United States, which so far has been provided unconditionally. He speculates that Netanyahu would welcome a war between the US and Iran, as it aligns with his long-term goals and those of his supporters. Reflecting on military strategies, he draws parallels with historical conflicts such as Vietnam, cautioning against assumptions that precision airstrikes alone can ensure success. He warns of the increased risks associated with modern air defense technology and the likelihood of prolonged and intensified resistance from Iran and potential allies like Russia and China. He notes a shift in regional alliances, with unlikely collaborations emerging among Muslim states driven partly by their opposition to US and Israeli actions, particularly in Gaza. He emphasizes the link between events in Gaza and the attacks on US forces and interests in the region, suggesting that resolving the situation in Gaza could mitigate hostilities against the US and its allies. He believes that the issue goes beyond just President Biden, asserting that both Republicans and the majority of Democrats are complicit in pursuing aggressive actions against Iran. He criticizes the misconception that bombing alone can bring about beneficial change, drawing parallels with past conflicts like Vietnam, where such tactics failed to yield the desired results and instead escalated hostilities. He predicts that Iran and other regional actors will adapt and resist in the face of military strikes, potentially drawing in additional support from neighboring countries. He highlights the likelihood of congressional approval for a declaration of war against Iran if sought by the president, suggesting a disconnect between political decisions and the understanding of the average American citizen regarding the consequences of war. He dismisses the notion of a ground invasion due to the inadequacy of US ground forces and the impracticality of mobilizing the country for such a conflict. He argues against the effectiveness of long-range strikes, likening them to sex without consequences, emphasizing the logistical challenges and limitations in sustaining such attacks. He warns against underestimating Iran's capabilities and the reality of the current geopolitical landscape compared to past conflicts. Emphasizing the need for a more nuanced and strategic approach, the stakes are considerably lower, and as a result, embarking on such a campaign won't bode well for us. It would likely evolve into a long and arduous endeavor. It's uncertain whether such actions would benefit anyone domestically, as they would be highly destructive and counterproductive. Looking back to 2002 and 2003, discussions within Rumsfeld's office indicated a primary objective of involving the US Army in Iraq, reminiscent of the aim to draw the US into Vietnam in 1965. However, there's a failure to consider the aftermath of such military intervention. While the loss of soldiers is regrettable, it shouldn't be the sole justification for declaring war. Instead, it should prompt a re-evaluation of strategic objectives and the costs of involvement in the region. The current perception of the need for war is heavily influenced by the relationship with Israel, which the Prime Minister is likely to exploit. Furthermore, the discussion around bombing Iran raises questions about target selection and strategy. Simply selecting targets isn't a comprehensive strategy, and the sheer number of potential targets and the resources required to neutralize them must be carefully considered. There is skepticism about whether thorough planning and analysis have been conducted to anticipate the consequences of such actions. It appears highly unlikely. There are very few countries capable of significantly aiding us in any material way. Have you ever wondered what really determines the success of international military interventions? Is it the sheer size of the military force, or does the strategy behind their actions play a pivotal role? Today, we'll delve deep into this intricate world of military prowess and strategy. When we think about global military powerhouses, The United States and Russia often dominate the conversation. The United States, with its vast resources and advanced technology, boasts an impressive military capability. They're known for their quick response times and ability to deploy troops globally. However, their strategy often leans towards direct intervention, which can lead to drawn-out conflicts and significant resource expenditure. On the other hand, Russia, another global military powerhouse, tends to focus more on regional power projection. Their strategy involves leveraging their geographic advantage and using asymmetric tactics to achieve their objectives. This approach often leads to more localized conflicts, but it also means they have a greater influence in their immediate vicinity. Now, let's turn our gaze towards the east, to Japan. Despite its pacifist constitution, Japan possesses a self-defense force that is technologically advanced and highly disciplined. However, their strategy is primarily defensive, with a focus on protecting their homeland. Interestingly, they lack a reciprocal arrangement for assistance in emergencies, a fact underscored by President Trump during his visit to Japan. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom, despite having a relatively small army of around 72,000 soldiers, often shows a willingness to commit ground forces to international conflicts. Recently, they've discussed committing ground forces to Ukraine, a move that seems to stray from rational strategic thinking. Given the terrain and the scale of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the entire British army would still be insufficient. This highlights a disconnect between the realities of military capabilities and the rhetoric surrounding international interventions. To summarize, military capabilities and strategies vary greatly between countries. The United States, with its direct intervention strategy, often finds itself in protracted conflicts. Russia focuses on regional power projection, leveraging its geographic advantage. Japan, despite its advanced self-defense force, is primarily defensive and lacks reciprocal support arrangements. The United Kingdom, though having a relatively small army, often shows a willingness to commit ground forces to international conflicts, even when it may not be strategically rational. Each of these approaches has its strengths and weaknesses, and understanding them is key to making sense of international military interventions. The critical takeaway is that military capabilities and strategies do not exist in a vacuum. They are deeply intertwined with a country's history, geography, and political landscape. Understanding this complexity helps us appreciate the challenges and intricacies of international military interventions.